Webinar that is on COVID-19 and Parkinson's disease. My name is Patrik Brundin. I'm at the Andel Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan in the States. And I'm hosting this webinar. I'm going to introduce you to our panelists. Before I do that, I just want to thank our sponsors. They are the Journal of Parkinson's Disease, Parkinson's Movement, and the Cure Parkinson's Trust. So without their help, this webinar would not happen. We have several of you listening in online, and we know that you may already have questions, and you very likely will generate questions as you hear what we talk about. And we welcome all of you to put those questions in the Q&A box. So if you go to the bottom of your Zoom panel, you can see there's something called Q&A with a couple of little bubbles next to it. And if you click on that, there'll be a box that opens up and you can put the questions there. I'll be monitoring that box. I'll be preparing to hand those questions out to our panelists. Sometimes the questions might be more suitable for answering in writing, or we may not have time to answer all of them. Then I'll just reserve them for that. But we're going to try to get through most of the questions if that's possible. The other thing I'd like to say is at the end of this, probably by tomorrow, you will be able to watch this webinar in its entirety on YouTube, and it'll be on the YouTube channel that belongs to Cure Parkinson's Trust, and hopefully also on the Parkinson's Movement's YouTube channel. So you can go back and listen again if there are bits that you missed or were particularly excited about. Well, with this, let me now introduce you to our outstanding panelists. I'm really happy with the ones we have. We have first Dr. Sonia Matul. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Patrik. I'm a family physician, now retired from clinical duties, but involved with patient advocacy and education. I live outside of Toronto in Canada, and I'm also a Parkinson's patient, having been diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's about 23 years ago. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our next panelist is David Beckham. And I know those of you in Britain get excited. You should be excited, but not for that reason. David, who are you?
Thanks so much for the invitation, Patrik, and appreciate the opportunity to participate. So I'm a physician scientist and associate professor at University of Colorado. I'm actually a virologist and an infectious disease specialist, and my laboratory studies how viruses infect the central nervous system and how the immune system responds to that.
Thank you, David. And finally, we have Dr. Alfonso Festano. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Patrik. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to discuss this important topic for all the attendees today. And my name is Alfonso Fasano. I'm a neurologist, so I'm a clinician. I co-direct the surgical program in Toronto at the Toronto Western Hospital in Canada. I'm also a professor of neurology at the University of Toronto and a clinician investigator at Crandall Brain Institute.
Thank you so much. Well, let's kick off with our first question. We have a couple of questions that have also come in via email prior to this webinar. But let's start with some of the basic parameters here. What is a coronavirus, and how does a coronavirus differ from, for example, the common flu viruses, influenza, and what are the mechanisms of infection when it comes to coronaviruses like SARS-CoV-2? And maybe David, you could kick us off here and explain a little bit.
Right. So coronaviruses are an interesting group of viruses. They're different from influenza viruses in that they exist in a lot of different mammals. So we know of a whole host of coronaviruses that live in bats, and bats are the reservoir. And the current, so the common cold versions of the coronaviruses probably evolved about 800 years ago or so. And those just kind of contribute to some of the common colds that we see that circulate, and have been doing that for hundreds of years now. And so beginning about 20 years ago or so, we started to see these severe kind of deadly versions of these coronaviruses evolve. And about every 5 years or so, we've seen pandemics, both in humans, but also in mammalian populations like pigs that have been devastating across the globe. And so about every 5 years or so, 5 to 10 years, we've seen emergence of a new kind of deadly version of these coronaviruses. And so they're able to evolve quickly and can change and have caused these kind of severe forms of these infections that we're seeing right now. The
Can I just
virus,
interrupt you,
yeah,
David? I have a
yeah.
question myself actually here. So why did these appear 20 years ago? What are the events that led them to enter
Right.
humankind at that?
So it's a great question. And I think there's probably, so those of us that study emerging infections, we think there's multiple things that have contributed to the emergence of some of these novel infections in human populations, whether it's coronavirus or Ebola or whatever. And one of them is deforestation, expansion of human populations, and increased population densities, not just of humans, but also of our food sources, and then intermixing of all those things. So you have new human populations in high densities moving into new deforested areas with their animal husbandry in different parts of the world. And that has introduced, we think, an increased frequency of introductions. And you combine that with global warming and all these other global events that are occurring, it's kind of become an ideal environment for the emergence of these new infections over the last 20 to 30 years, right?
Very interesting. So how do they then get into the human body once they are transferred from the animals?
Right. So, and this has been a point of confusion, I think. So coronaviruses are all respiratory viruses, and they are spread by breathing in this virus. They can be spread by touch, by touching contaminated surfaces, but that's not a very efficient method of spread. So the way this works is someone is speaking that's sick, or someone coughs or sneezes. The virus depends on that, actually, and depends on that as a mode of transmission, because it uses that in the particles that are released to then be breathed in, if you will, by the next person. There's a high density of receptors for the virus in both the upper airway, where you breathe in these viruses, but also in the lungs. And so when the next person comes along and breathes in the virus, it's able to quickly bind to these receptors. The main receptor for this virus, for SARS-CoV-2, is this ACE2 receptor. They're in high density in the upper airway, in the nose, and also in the lungs. And so the virus is able to bind to those cells and then infect them. And that's kind of where it gets started. So that's how it moves from person to person.
So do we all have the same amount of this receptor? Does this vary between people genetically or over ages?
Yeah. So, I mean, all of us have these receptors in our upper airway, these ACE2 receptors. There's probably some variability in expression. There's also variability, we know, in from person to person in terms of the sequences, the actual gene sequences of those, but they're pretty highly conserved across primates. That's why we're able to use non-human primates in some of our vaccine trials. And so, so the virus is able to bind those receptors, and all of us have these receptors in our upper airways. There might be, differences in density of the receptors and things like that, but they're all there in everybody, and the sequence is typically, relatively well conserved amongst humans and primates.
So we got a question, our first question. I'm going to pose it immediately because it is a bit related to what you just said, David. It's why does the virus keep developing new variants? And is there more concern about the new variant found in Japan recently?
Right. So we see this in the lab. So whenever you passage an RNA virus, and at any kind of rate, it will accumulate mutations. And the higher the rate of passage, meaning the more times you passage it, and the more that happens per unit time, the more likely the virus is to collect mutations. These viruses are very good at intentionally making mistakes when they replicate, and then using that evolutionarily as a way to kind of get better at causing infection. So this is actually expected for all RNA viruses. And then the big question becomes, what's the result of that? Sometimes it's nothing, and we see variants, what we call replacement variants, that develop, and sometimes the actual clinical outcome of that is actually nothing. But sometimes it can be something like we've seen with the UK variant, where it's doing something that the virus wants to do, which is spread better. And then the other point to make is, just because the virus makes a mutation doesn't mean it's going to become more deadly. If you think about it from the virus's point of view, it doesn't want to become more deadly. It wants to replicate more. It wants to spread more. And that's kind of the driver.
You're speaking as if the virus was thinking. Obviously, it's not thinking, though. But if you can explain this in evolutionary terms, what you mean is that why do the viruses that infect well and spread well do well, whereas those that kill people rapidly don't do so well? Explain that.
Yeah, so it's an evolutionary concept, right? So viruses are basically genetic machines, and they have existed for billions of years along with our cells. And so they're the ultimate in an evolutionary machine. And so they intentionally accumulate mutations it's a mechanism that they've utilized in their genetic code. And they intentionally make mistakes. Some of those mistakes actually results in the virus not replicating very well, and that virus is selected against. And the ones that replicate better and reproduce better, those actually tend to win. And so the virus uses that, what we call selection pressure, as a way to kind of ensure that it's able to succeed. So it's kind of a basic fundamental mechanism of genetic selection that these viruses use and have used for billions of years to change, evolve, and develop.
So before we move on to the brain, maybe you could also just summarize in 20 seconds, what are the classical respiratory, gastrointestinal, and general malaise features of this infection. And then I'm going to ask after that Dr. Fasano, Alfonso, to tell us a little bit about neurology and SARS-CoV-2. But David, so what happens? What is it isn't the sniffles, as they would say in the US, but some people actually do get a very mild disease. But explain, what does it look like, and why does it vary so much?
Right. Yeah, so we know that it varies from person to person. Age is a huge, important factor in terms of how severe the disease you're going to get or potentially will get. There's multiple other things, diabetes, hypertension, things like that. So the host plays a big role in how bad the infection is going to be. In the patients that we see in the hospital, the vast majority of them come in, like Patrik was saying, with kind of initial symptoms of maybe some fever, maybe a cough, not feeling well, weak, fatigue, body aches, which is kind of what you get with like influenza or something like that. And then in some people it gets better, and they're able to kind of just work through it and take some Tylenol. But in some people with some of these underlying risks, it progresses. The fevers tend to go away, but not always. And some people can develop more and more trouble breathing. We know that in those groups, we see very characteristic infection in the lungs. It's kind of a diffuse infection in multiple areas of the lungs all at once. And so it can significantly compromise the ability of the lungs to bring in oxygen into the body. And this is really what drives the whole problem, is you get these, what we call multifocal pneumonias, where there's just infection throughout the lungs. And this process can continue on for several weeks and actually injure the ability of the lungs to function. And that's how people get really sick.
So excellent. So we're going to let you go for a few seconds here, David, but before you go do that, two quick questions. Is swine flu a type of coronavirus?
So swine flu is not a coronavirus. It's actually an influenza virus. It's called H1N1 that kind of emerged, as everyone knows, about 10 or so years ago. We use the term, I think, in the public, flu, when people get kind of like a virus-like syndrome. But that syndrome can be caused by multiple different respiratory viruses. And influenza or swine flu is one of them.
In the context of mutations, you talked about passaging the virus. So just a few words. What do you mean by passaging?
Right. So a passage just means a process of a virus getting into an organism, a cell or something, replicating itself, and then moving on to the next one. And so that's a single passage. And so each time the virus does that, it makes mistakes. And some of those mistakes are going to be hurtful. Some of them aren't going to matter. And some of them are actually going to, a rare number of them will help the virus. And so you can see why the more the virus does that per unit time, it's able to collect more of those beneficial mutations.
Thank you. So now we've dealt with what the virus is and what it does in the lungs and other parts of the body, but what happens in terms of the brain, Alfonso? What sorts of neurological and psychiatric symptoms can one get following COVID-19?
Like we discussed already, the manifestation of the infection is very variable, and even when it comes to neurology, it is variable. And usually we don't see a lot of neurological complications. It's important to remind ourselves that the neurological complications of the infection are extremely low, especially if you compare that to fever, for instance. And even there, as I said already, you have a vast list of problems that the virus can cause. And in order to make it simple, probably we need to talk about the mechanisms of these effects. So as you heard already, there might be just general malaise, but some of this malaise is actually neurological in nature. For instance, headache, muscle pain, those are in theory neurological signs, but these are mainly caused by a more systemic effect of the viruses. Then there are indirect effects. As you heard already, there might be respiratory issues, and obviously hypoxia, so poor oxygenation in the blood, also causes neurological problems because the brain is a very sensitive organ. So when there's not enough oxygen, you may have confusion, you may have even delirium is being reported in elderly patients. And obviously, some of these patients end up in the ICU, and there you need to deal with the other complications of being admitted to the ICU for a long time, or also the specific drugs that are used in the ICU. But those are not specific. So talking about the specific effect of the virus on the nervous system, again, talking about the reasons why we're talking about this different systems and problems, certainly an inflammatory effect is to be taken into account. And when I talk about inflammation, I'm talking about something called cytokinic storm. Cytokines are inflammatory proteins that are released by the body to fight the virus. And when there are too many, we have a storm in the system, and this can also induce neurological problems. Particularly, this can increase the permeability of the vessels in the brain. So you may have actually even hemorrhages being reported in the thalamus, which is a part of the brain, but that's rare. What's been also reported, talking about inflammation, is something called autoimmunity. So the body tries to fight the virus, producing antibodies, and possibly some of these antibodies are affecting the brain itself. There are at this point, I think, around a dozen of patients with something called myoclonus. Myoclonus is like jerk-like movements of the body. And this myoclonus is being reported not right after the infection, but actually when the body is fighting the infection. And this is also responsive to drugs used to treat inflammatory conditions like steroids, for instance, or plasma exchange, implying that there is indeed an autoimmune mechanism. Again, not very common. What's certainly more common is the vascular effect of the infections. And because of the inflammation, most likely, there is an inflammation also of the vessels. And it's known that inflammation can also trigger ischemia, so strokes or clots. And this has been reported very early in New York, for instance. The young patients in their 40s, for instance, developed very strange strokes, never reported before during a COVID infection. So that's something that is very different from the typical stroke you see in old people. And it's something that actually can be quite devastating, rare, but also relatively common, at least in young people.
Could I ask you there, Alfonso, are there preferred sites for those strokes in the brain where they tend to develop?
Yes, from what I don't remember the exact location of what was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but the pathologists are talking about endothelitis, so inflammation of the small vessels. I heard also the propensity of this to cause bleedings in the subarachnoid space. So certainly there are specific locations, and I know our stroke team is taking into account when they consider a possible COVID etiology, because like I said, it's not the typical stroke that you will see in old people. And finally, just to conclude with my list of different problems, and this is perhaps the most fascinating but also most difficult to address today, is about the direct effect of the virus in the brain. I know that there are questions already about the possible penetration of the virus in the central nervous system. And I think we need to be a bit more careful about this, because there are so many indirect effects, mentioned already inflammations, for instance, or general problems caused by the systemic infection. And from that to say, okay, that's the effect of the virus in the brain, it's a big jump. There is a way to do so, and to do so through pathology. So we have now accumulating experience from the brain of people that unfortunately died from the virus. And these brains are now evaluated by pathologists under the microscopes. And honestly, there is very little at the moment to say that the virus really gets into the brain. It can happen. I understand the same receptors that you heard mentioned before are expressed also in the brain. But I don't think that we can say today that this is a virus that is necessarily neurotropic, meaning that has a huge predisposition towards the targeting the neurons. We will see. In a year from now, we'll have a lot more information. But if anything, I want to say today, at least from my point of view, and maybe Patrik, you might disagree, is that at the moment we don't have a lot of evidence to claim a direct effect on the CNS. And in general, we have seen also these papers retracted from Lancet and other big journals. There's been a huge interest in this virus, a lot of publications, but sometimes too fast is not necessarily better. For some of the answers, we need to wait. And that's unfortunately what we need to tell us people in the field. Unfortunately, we don't have all the answers, and maybe we'll know more about the effect on the CNS, on the central nervous system, as we learn more from this terrible pandemic.
Well, that's true. And we have to remind ourselves this virus has really only been around for a year, or less than a year in parts of the world. So you're quite right. In terms of medical research and how quickly medical research can progress, it's remarkable how much we've learned, but there is truly a lot more to be learned. Now, there's one question here. Somebody's saying, is there anything younger people can do who get COVID to reduce the risks of strokes, Alfonso?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not a stroke neurologist, but I know that once again, the use on anti-inflammatory medications seem to be beneficial. I'm talking about obviously very difficult cases already admitted to the hospital. I'm not saying that everybody, as soon as COVID is diagnosed, should be on steroids, as someone was implying in the past. But I'm saying that it's clear that people that tend to have more of the vascular problems are the people that get a very bad infection, and it's been reported actually in the UK. The use of steroids in the ICU seems to be related to reduced mortality. Now the question is whether this is really going to reduce the occurrence of stroke. That's not been addressed by research at this point, but I would certainly consider as a possible thing to consider given the mechanism. The other big one is the use of anticoagulants. So powerful blood thinners. They are being used extensively at this point, and because these patients all have the propensity of developing clots, even when they don't have brain problems, but they have found to have deep venous thrombosis, so clots in the legs or in the lungs. And heparin, amongst the many others, has been used quite successfully. And actually, that's the other interesting thing that we're seeing now, that we're learning more and more. Obviously, the second wave is much worse than the first wave, and that's not a surprise. Even for the flu pandemic, the influenza pandemic of last century, the second wave was worse than the first wave. This is a wave we're having during the winter time. There are a lot of reasons to see why, and there's new variant. There is a lot more of cases, but if you look at mortality is not necessarily going up. And this is likely reflecting the fact that doctors have learned how to treat these conditions when it gets to the level of the ICU admission, for instance.
So thank you very much. So I'm going to shift now to Sonia. So people with Parkinson's, we have several questions. Will they get worsened symptoms temporarily or long term if they have COVID?
Well, that's a great question, and what's really relevant to the patient community at the moment. There was a study done by Fox Insight, which is the online study platform at the Michael J. Fox Foundation, and they did a survey last spring, I think between April and May, where they had about 7,200 respondents asking about COVID-19 infections and their Parkinson's symptoms. Over 5,000 people ended up replying. And of those, I think about 50 people actually had COVID. What they found was that over 55% of patients with Parkinson's disease that got COVID noticed a worsening of their motor symptoms. And about 20% actually developed new motor symptoms during that period of time that they were infected. An overwhelming 75% actually noticed an increase in their non-motor symptoms, things like cognition or mood issues or other autonomic issues, gut issues, which was kind of interesting. But the most interesting part was that people that had Parkinson's disease and didn't even get COVID-19 infection also showed an increase in their motor and non-motor symptoms. And I mean, that could be for a variety of reasons. And I think maybe we'll talk about it a bit later, but that leads to changes that not just the pandemic, the stress of the pandemic places on individuals in general, and particularly with Parkinson's disease or other neurological diseases or chronic illnesses, but also the public health measures that go along with it. And so, a lot of these respondents, and I hear this all the time in the community, we're talking about, decreased access to healthcare in terms of canceled appointments or inability to attend their allied health professional appointments, decreased access to medications, not getting their medications on time because of logistical issues, decrease in their daily activities such as food acquisition and housekeeping, things like canceled exercise classes, decreased social activities, which leads to social isolation. So all of these things together, which unfortunately were more evident in low economic and non-white respondents, unfortunately, as are many things in this time with medicine in general. But the psychological stress, the reduced exercise, the social isolation all seem to also affect people that may not have COVID, but are living through this pandemic as well.
So in relation to that, I can just mention that we had an article in the Journal of Parkinson's Disease that talked about the rapid deployment of telemedicine in Parkinson's because of a necessity. And I think that's one of the very few silver linings of this pandemic, that the medical community had to quickly discover the value of telemedicine. It doesn't replace the face-to-face and personal contact, but in some cases, at least, it's helpful. And actually, for some people with Parkinson's, it might be very helpful. They don't have to travel far and go through all the hassle of going to a hospital or a clinic, but they can still get good input from their physician or other health workers. But there was another question I thought for you here, Sonia. Somebody was asking Lloyd Cowan. He said, are people with PD considered more at risk for more severe symptoms if they get COVID? So this is, I understand the question is, the COVID symptoms, are they more likely to be severe in a person with Parkinson's?
Well, I think maybe Alfonso can also maybe discuss this as well. But I mean, from what I've read and from what I understand, I'm young onto Parkinson's disease, but the majority of our community is elderly. So people who are elderly also have other comorbidities such as high blood pressure or heart disease or diabetes, these sorts of age-related illnesses. So I could certainly hypothesize that people with Parkinson's disease, in the majority, particularly if they're of advanced stage of their illness due to chest wall issues and breathing and aspiration issues that they may have in advanced disease, as well as the comorbidities that they have, would put them at an increased risk for worse clinical outcomes should they have COVID infection.
So do you want to add to that, Alfonso?
Yes, thank you. Well, I've been working on this field for some time now, because even before the pandemic was a big problem in Canada too. Being Italian, I was in touch already with a lot of Italians, and as you remember, Italy was very hardly hit at the beginning of the pandemic. So I saw this as an opportunity for me, for the scientific community, to understand the impact of the pandemic on Parkinson's patients. So we've done some studies in this regard, and I can say that and maybe this is the starting point. When we say Parkinson's disease, we don't say anything, because Parkinson's disease is a variety of problems, it's a variety of conditions that simplifying we call Parkinson's disease, but there are 10,000 reasons, as we all know. Well, maybe not 10,000, but there are many reasons for someone to display features that are Parkinson's disease. So because of this variability, also the expression of the virus or the infection when you have COVID is very variable. And there are a lot of other factors, like Sonia mentioned, age, for instance. So typically, age is a risk factor for Parkinson's, and clearly many Parkinson's disease with COVID tend to be also on the older side, and maybe also more male than female. We know that it's already a discrepancy in that sense. And we know that actually COVID-19 tends to be more severe in older people, looks like more severe in male than female. So there are a lot of confounders here. So when we say Parkinson's disease and the effect of COVID on Parkinson's disease, is a little bit complicated, also because Parkinson's disease per se introduces a number of other variables like dementia or systemic issues like blood pressure problems. So per se, Parkinson's, when we say Parkinson's and COVID, we say nothing, because we need to specify what type of patient you're talking about. But as for the manifestation of COVID in Parkinson's, going back to the question, we have no reason to believe that the expression of the infection is necessarily different. There are, for instance, the study we did in Italy, we found that Parkinson's patients tend to report less often respiratory problems. But we also argued that maybe it's because of the disease that they feel less the respiratory problems, or maybe some people confuse they are mistaking their respiratory symptoms that some people have even before infections because of Parkinson's with the effect of the disease or the infection, I mean. But here, really no major results. Another study, again from Italy, from a colleague of mine, found that Parkinson's patients were found to have a bit more diarrhea than other people with COVID but without Parkinson's, and there have been people implying that this might be a manifestation of the so-called dysautonomia. So Parkinson's patients, people with Parkinson's have issues with constipation, sometimes that triggers other issues. So it's really a mixed bag of different variables, and it's difficult to really pinpoint what is causing what, but in general, I would say no difference.
So somebody asked here if the anti-Parkinson medication in any way could interfere with the viral infection. I don't know personally that that's been reported. Does anybody know that if that's the case?
That's the reason why actually I did the first study, because I was there were particularly 4 drugs of interest. First one obviously is Amantadine. Amantadine is a very old drug used for, back then was used for the influenza virus. And now people were saying, well, influenza virus, we had a pandemic in the past, right? Well, we had many pandemics. Influenza is another RNA virus. So they were implying, okay, maybe Amantadine would be protective against COVID. And there are some publications implying that. There are also some basic science paper implying that. But when we looked at our patients and also in other series, we didn't find any difference between people taking amantadine versus people not taking amantadine with respect to getting the infection or the outcome of the infection. Full disclosure, however, we're talking about small numbers. But anyways, amantadine is one. Second, dopamine, because there was an analysis of the expression of the ACE2 protein, which is used for by the virus to enter the cells, and other genes. And it was found that this protein is very often co-expressed, so produced by the cell together with another protein involved in dopamine metabolism. And even there, we haven't found any effect on total dose of levodopa, for instance. The other one is entacapone. There was a study, entacapone is another drug for Parkinson's, of course, and there was a study looking at the computer simulation, what product we have that we already use in humans that can interact with the proteins of the virus. And entacapone was one of them. But again, we didn't find any effect. And well, the fourth one will be dopamine agonist for the same reason I mentioned. And actually, we did find an effect of dopamine agonist. We found that people on dopamine agonist tend to have less severe COVID. However, we tend to use dopamine agonist in younger patients with people with Parkinson's disease. So again, it's probably the effect of the age, not the medication. Just an example how complex it can be to do this type of research.
And somebody asked if there's any evidence of long-term effects of COVID on patients with Parkinson's. I'm going to answer that question by saying I don't believe we have long-term follow-ups in sufficient numbers in a systematic fashion yet. That's a very interesting question, and a study that one can do in 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. I think it would be very interesting. But based on all of this discussion you had now, which I thought was extremely interesting and valuable, several people have asked questions. Should people with Parkinson's be included within shielded groups, or does that decision depend on the severity of each individual's symptoms? That was David Martin's question, and Rochelle Flanagan posed a similar question. She says, Dr. Michael Okun, he had a webinar actually on this similar topic just a few days ago. He's calling for people with Parkinson's to be further up the chain for getting a vaccine. Do you think people with Parkinson's should be in higher risk category and get the vaccine earlier? So should they be more shielded, or should they get the vaccine earlier? Who wants to answer that? Sonia, do you want to kick that off?
I'm still a little disappointed in the amantadine thing, considering I've been taking mine quite regularly, hoping that some of the studies are true.
Still...
Well, take vitamin D.
Yes. I think that's a question as well.
Yeah, there is a vitamin D question also.
I mean, again, I think by virtue of the fact that a lot of our community is older and has other comorbidities, they will be kind of prioritized anyway. A lot of long-term care facilities, particularly here in Canada, I can tell you, are getting immunized right away because of their high risk due to the infection spreading very rapidly in those communities. Per se, in terms of, say, myself, young onset, I wouldn't be given that opportunity. And personally, without any lung issues and without any other comorbidities, I don't really think that I necessarily need to be prioritized. I'm not aware, and again, Alfonso, maybe you may be able to answer this better than I, but I'm not aware of any really specific reasons why someone who's otherwise healthy and young would need to be immunized sooner than, say, an elderly person without Parkinson's.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And like I said already, it's variable what people have. I think age is the main thing to look at, and also overall frailty. So other lung diseases, cognitive problems, heart issues, immunosuppression. So Parkinson's itself, it's a label, but it doesn't mean that someone with Parkinson's will have a higher risk of a poor outcome after the infection.
I have another question that I'm going to direct to you, David. It is about vaccines, and it's an interesting question. Charlotte Allen says, if the professionals are still learning about the virus, why do they still say that the vaccine, quote unquote, will work? Why is the medical community so confident, and what have the vaccine studies shown?
Right. So it's a great question, and I think there's a I've been involved in the vaccine trials. I've helped with them. I've now been vaccinated. I would say I'm a believer, so take that for what it's worth. But we have really good clinical data now for the vaccines that are FDA, at least in the US, that have received FDA approval, and in other countries that have received approval. They've gone through rigorous clinical trials to not only show that they produce a robust immune response in a wide range of all the people that are at risk, like we're talking about, but also that they prevent disease. So, for example, the Pfizer vaccine in the phase 3 clinical trial, it was clear that it had 100% efficacy. I mean, think about that, 100% efficacy in the trial for preventing severe COVID disease, meaning people that were in the hospital and really sick. It had 95% efficacy for just preventing preventing people from getting sick. These are really efficacious vaccines. I think the crux of this, the hard part with this, is that the science has moved so quickly. I think that people see this and they're kind of, and they're kind of like, how can this be? We still don't have a great influenza vaccine. How can this, be? And I think this just shows when you kind of have a global effort of the scientific and medical community and all these different countries working together. The trial I was working on, we had 9 different countries involved in that trial. So it just shows that when you have a global effort of all of our scientific and medical communities working together, we can push these kind of advancements quickly.
Is it fair also to say that modern molecular biology made the preclinical development of the vaccines incredibly rapid and easy and efficient?
Thanks, Patrick. I think that's a really important point, is that this is something that just didn't materialize out of thin air. These new technologies, these mRNA vaccines, had been developed over the last 10 to 20 years by biomedical investment in different countries, obviously, working to develop new vaccine approaches that were more robust and able to be developed more quickly. So we've been working on these types of approaches and platforms for new emerging infections for quite a while now. And so this is kind of the culmination of all that. So I kind of describe it to my kids as, the old vaccines were kind of the Model T, and now we're in the Mars rover era of vaccines. And this is kind of, this is the new world, is that we have these really great technologies that'll continue to develop and will give us great tools to respond not just to this pandemic, but future challenges.
I mean, the amazing thing was that one of the first vaccines was designed within a matter of a few days, once they knew the sequence and that was for that key protein. So, but there is a question, you touched upon this, but just Rochelle Flanagan asked this question, just to be very clear here. What is now known? Is it true that if you get a vaccine, A, you can still carry the virus and transmit it, and B, still get COVID yourself? Well, the second question, maybe even I will answer, that the likelihood that you get COVID is very low in terms of real major symptoms. But with A, still carry the virus and transmit it? David.
It's a very, very important point. So we know that the vaccines prevent disease, and they're very good at that. In the preclinical studies where they used animal models, non-human primate models, and other models, there is some evidence in those preclinical studies that the vaccine did not alter nasal carriage of the virus, meaning the vaccinated and placebo-treated animals had similar amounts of virus in the upper airway. Now, that is a model where they're aerosolizing, virus directly into the nasal passages. So in humans, we don't know the answer to that, and it's going to be a critical point to answer. But I think the take-home point is, when you get your vaccine, you should still be wearing a mask. You should still be social distancing. You should still be following all the guidance to protect your loved ones, other people in the community who haven't been vaccinated yet. And I think this is just going to So I think we need to be very careful about that. So I think I appreciate the question. It's very important.
So we've had a couple of questions related to vaccines and Parkinson's, and I think I can deal with them relatively easily. One is, will development of these vaccines ultimately help development of Parkinson vaccines or treatments? And is there a possibility of a vaccine being developed quickly for Parkinson's disease? This is from Martha Johnson and from Rochelle Flanagan again. So the answer to that question is that there are several vaccine or vaccine-like immunotherapy trials ongoing for Parkinson's. And in these, almost all of them are targeting alpha-synuclein, the protein that forms clumps that we call Lewy bodies. And they are at various stages of clinical development. Several companies are involved, and we really don't know if there is any efficacy. Some of those programs have shown that they are safe, but it's far too early to say if they'll ever be efficacious, because we actually don't know if the Lewy bodies are dangerous in Parkinson's or if they're an epiphenomenon. Some schools of thought say that the Lewy bodies are a part of the causative pathway of the disease. Others say that they're byproducts of something else that causes the disease, and perhaps they aren't dangerous. But that prompts me actually to shift our discussion a little bit to a fascinating area. And I'm going to ask David to tell us a little bit of work that he's done on another RNA virus called West Nile virus, and how he found that the protein alpha-synuclein, which is the one that forms the Lewy bodies in Parkinson's disease, seems to be involved in the defense mechanism, the body's defense against this West Nile virus. Explain what this is and how you found it and what it might mean.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I appreciate the question. So, here in Colorado, we have kind of annual outbreaks of West Nile virus, which is a virus that directly infects the central nervous system in some people. And so going back about 6 years ago now, I was actually seeing a patient in the ICU and with one of my trainees, and we were looking at the MRI, and it was a patient that had been admitted with encephalitis. And the patient had very focal injury in the substantia nigra, and also had injury in the thalamus. So we were just looking at the MRI, and I said, "Oh, this patient has West Nile virus." And the trainee looked at me and said, "Well, why is it affecting the substantia nigra?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Why don't you know?" So I went back to the lab, and we started just looking into where we study these viruses and how they infect the nervous system. We started looking into what could potentially be playing a role in injuring some of these areas in the midbrain, substantia nigra, thalamus, and some of these areas. So long story short, we basically started studying alpha-synuclein because we found out, at least at the time, that it wasn't really clear what it does. It's in neurons, but it wasn't clear what it was doing in the neurons. You can knock it out in the mice with a genetic mechanism, and the mice don't seem to care. And so what we did is we actually infected mice with West Nile virus that didn't, so the mice didn't have synuclein or did. And the mice that didn't have synuclein almost looked like they didn't have an immune response. They died very quickly or got sick very quickly from the infection and from encephalitis. And so over the subsequent years, we've published a paper, and we have another paper that's in review, where we found that in the neurons, synuclein actually functions to kind of modulate or help the neurons express what's called interferon-stimulated genes, which are genes that are important in the response to virus infections. And so we have a good amount of data now that that alpha-synuclein, at least in neurons, potentially plays a role in what we call innate immunity for the neurons, meaning synuclein is modulating the neuron's ability to mount an innate immune response to an antigen, whether it's West Nile virus or some other kind of potential invasive pathogen. We think it's playing a role in the neuron's ability to fight off that pathogen.
So as a neuroscientist, when I read about David's work a few years ago, I was fascinated because alpha-synuclein's presence in the Lewy body was identified around 1997, and we always believed it was a protein that had to do with the neurons neurochemical communication, handling those small vesicles where neurotransmitters are and perhaps involved in the machinery of neurochemical communication between neurons. But David's observations suggest that synuclein may have another job, and that job might also then be important to neurons. And that's one idea why then maybe Lewy bodies could form in response potentially to a viral infection. And there are now 3 case reports of people who've developed acutely Parkinsonism, so it's not the disease, but they've developed Parkinson's symptoms a few weeks following severe COVID, so COVID that required hospitalization. Those 3 cases are described in the literature in 3 separate publications. One was in Spain, one was in Israel, and the third case was in, well, I'm blanking where the third case was, but maybe Alfonso will remember where the third case was. But that aside,
I think it's,
yeah, so,
I think Europe somewhere. I don't remember where.
Okay. But the interesting thing is, these were people who were previously healthy. They had none of the typical signs of prodromal Parkinson's. They hadn't been examined, of course, for that, but they couldn't report any constipation or hyposmia or anything like this before getting COVID, and they were relatively young. And in one case, they even looked for Parkinson risk genes and didn't find any. There was no family history. And yet they developed these remarkable symptoms. So I'd like to ask the panel, what could this be due to? And in these cases, if the virus gets into the brain, do you think it's getting into the brain through the bloodstream, which we talked about at the beginning? Alfonso talked about this. Do we think that even the virus needs to get into the brain if it gets in through the bloodstream, or does it get in via nerves, for example, the nerves that innervate the nose and the tongue and so on? But is it possible that this acute onset of Parkinsonism is purely an effect of vascular lesions, the ones that Alfonso mentioned before? I should add, those 3 cases, they were also studied with brain scans, and there was evidence for loss of dopamine function in those patients. So what do you think? Alfonso, I know that you're probably going to say it's too early to say what this is, and I agree. We haven't seen the brains. These people have fortunately survived. Yeah. One of them recovered spontaneously, and the other 2 responded well to typical Parkinson medication.
Yeah, maybe exactly what you just said is the key, because we're talking about, at least in one case, of a reversible problem. This is the Spanish patient, and actually I was in touch with the author trying to understand what happened to this man. So this is, of the 3, I guess, this is the most interesting, in my opinion, for a simple reason. This person described by the Spanish authors in Madrid has completely different symptom that you will expect according to what we know being Parkinson's disease. Particularly, this person has myoclonus. I mentioned the myoclonus jerks before. This person has oculomotor problems. This person received a special SPECT, a special imaging of the heart. I don't want to get too technical, but this SPECT usually is abnormal in Parkinson's disease. And in this particular patient, it wasn't abnormal. Instead, the dopamine in the brain was found to be lower. So this man did indeed show symptoms unrelated to what we call Parkinson's disease. And this is the person that is improving spontaneously. When I spoke with the authors, they told me that is almost back to baseline, is not yet there, and they're waiting to reports now. They repeated that scan to measure the dopamine in the brain to see whether that has changed in the meantime, and then we're waiting to see what they publish. But we don't have this published yet. It will be published soon, I guess. As for the other 2 instead, first of all, we don't have a lot of information about these other 2. Well, we don't know whether they have additionally typical features, but it's also possible that these were people, I know it's unlikely, but it's also a possibility that these were people with Parkinson's already that was compensated. We know that many people with Parkinson's develop symptoms, for instance, after a general anesthesia or after a big trauma, after a car accident, and that's not the cause, that's a trigger. And it's possible the huge stress to the body caused by the infection triggered a decompensated brain, someone that was already meant to have Parkinson's later on. Obviously, this is just a theory, and I don't want to say that's necessarily what's going to, just what's happening, but we need to take this into account.
That's also very interesting, because it then means that if that is true, then some of the mechanisms that occur in COVID are those that might promote Parkinsonism or the development of disease. So we talked about vascular lesions, but we also briefly touched upon neuroinflammation, which we've had webinars, I think, entirely devoted to inflammation. And neuroinflammation is very prominent in Parkinson's disease, and systemic inflammation and neuroinflammation seems to be very prominent in the severe cases of COVID. So maybe that's a driver. David and Sonia, do you have any views on this? Do you think these were people who were on the brink of getting Parkinson's? I mean, you can only guess. We don't have any answers.
Well,
and this pushed them over the cliff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't have a neuroscientist's perspective on this. That's not my area of expertise, but I certainly know that any kind of physical challenge or mental or emotional challenge can certainly worsen a patient's Parkinson's symptoms, and even sometimes necessitate an increase in their medications temporarily until that stress resolves. And it wouldn't, in the prodromal phase of Parkinson's, last for so long when you really have mild or no symptoms, that I can sort of see from a clinical standpoint how this kind of stress of a COVID infection could push someone in that direction and then resolve once the infection resolves, but may present in the future. And I think that point about having to follow these patients long-term is a very valid one. I don't think we'll really quite know the answer until we do.
And I can answer a question that is related to this that we got from Vijay Rangachari. He says, is there any evidence for potentially increased numbers of Lewy bodies in COVID-infected patients? And to the best of my knowledge, there is no such evidence. I know that actually one person with Parkinson's disease who developed severe COVID and passed away in Finland, if I remember rightly, has been reported, but they just report that there were Lewy bodies as one would expect in Parkinson's disease after several years. But I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of any report saying that there is an upregulation of synuclein or aggregation of synuclein following COVID. Have you heard anything like that, David?
No, I haven't heard of any kind of actual, pathological link, if you will, between an acute COVID infection and actually the pathogenesis of Parkinson's, whether it be Lewy bodies or changes in synuclein expression in the brain. But I think, it's a larger question that we get a lot, is that, for many years now, acute virus infections have been associated with these Parkinsonian-like features. We see it with West Nile. Patients can come in, whether, West Nile virus, Japanese encephalitis virus, there's other of these viruses that infect the nervous system that can cause some of these acute Parkinsonian features. So I think one of the big questions is there some link between what's going on during that acute viral infection and the pathogenesis in Parkinson's? Viruses may not cause Parkinson's, but is there some link between the mechanisms that are causing these features that we can study and kind of understand more?
That's for the sake of
that is a great, Alfonso.
Just a quick question. I guess I know the answer, but it's better probably to make it clear. The Parkinsonism you're talking about, the one caused by West Nile, for instance, those are reversible, right?
Yeah, so it's a very important point. I agree. Is that, these patients will come in with these acute features and they typically get better. They go away and they don't necessarily go on to develop what we call Parkinson's disease. And so I think one of the questions is, at least that we've had, is are there links between these different entities, but can they give us some clues in terms of the pathogenesis of Parkinson's by studying what happens acutely during these virus infections, right?
So I'm afraid we're going to have to draw to an end. This has been really exciting. We could go on for another hour. We've answered 18 questions, but we have 22 questions still open. Some of them are about loss of sense of smell in COVID. Is that in any way related to Parkinson's? And of course, when we just now said that we don't know anything about neuropathology in these three individuals, we really don't know if there is a link. But what we do know is some neuropathological studies indicate that the olfactory system is engaged in COVID-19. So that's of interest. It's a route of entry. And interestingly, the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagal nerve, the nerve that innervates the gut, is also showing inflammation in COVID-19 cases, a paper that just came out 2 weeks ago. So maybe there is a link. We simply don't know. It's important that we find out. I think you've all said that there's much more to be learned. And I want to thank the panelists, David Beckham, Sonia Matul, and Alfonso Festano, for sharing your vast knowledge on this rapidly evolving field. And we'll try to answer some of the questions via email to those of you who have signed up and where we didn't get a chance to reach you. Thank you, everybody. We will be back in 3 months from now, and it's going to be a webinar on young onset Parkinson's disease next time. Thank you for listening in. Bye-bye.
Bye.